Ed Miliband as Foreign Secretary is going to be a controversial choice. I think right now, publicly, I think the US side is deciding to, be a good ally as they see it and try and, welcome Andy Burnham. But certainly in advance, there was a story Stephen Smithford and I did a few weeks ago, which was US officials warning that they were concerned about Ed Miliband becoming Chancellor. Now, I think those same officials had some concerns about Ed Miliband becoming Foreign Secretary.
Katy Balls is the Washington editor at The Times and The Sunday Times. Hello, Katy.
Hello.
Thank you for being with us. Let's begin with how Washington is reacting to Andy Burnham's arrival in Downing Street. Burnham spoke with Donald Trump yesterday. The readout from Downing Street said that he congratulated the president for hosting the World Cup. He invited him to Manchester, and he told him about his plans for ensuring good growth in every postcode. Do we know, Katy, what Donald Trump made of all that?
We do, because Donald Trump did not, as is custom, go through an official White House readout, but instead took, in true Donald Trump style, to Truth Social to share his thoughts. And it was a pretty positive post, I think, to be fair. He ultimately said that he had a good conversation with Andy Burnham. He said that Andy Burnham had a very tough job ahead of him, but he believed that Andy Burnham could do it, and America was here to help him. So I think probably from a Team Burnham perspective, it couldn't have gone too much better in terms of the official White House reaction from the man himself. Of course, I think the slight issue is what Donald Trump thinks is helping world leader isn't always what they might think is helping, all the electorate does. So, and Donald Trump also, if we think about his posts, for example, on Sunday saying, congratulating Andy Burnham on changes to policies on gas and oil, it's not clear that those policies are actually about to be announced by the Labour government to the extent that Donald Trump thinks they are. So I think it was a good start. I think with Donald Trump, we know that he changes his opinions of leaders quite regularly, and probably the real test, while he is a little bit vibes, and I can understand why Andy Burnham's personality might work a bit in that environment. For example, thinking about how Trump got on with Mandani, the New York Democratic Socialist mayor, even though on paper they shouldn't. I think, the real issues are going to come down to some issues on defence, energy and so forth.
Yeah, well, we'll come to them in a moment. But how likely is it, do we think, that he's going to visit Manchester? It doesn't strike me as very likely.
So it sounded unlikely yesterday when we had the initial, initial unofficial readout, because obviously we knew the call was happening because Andy Burnham had said that he was going to prioritize calls with the US president and with the Ukrainian leader Zelensky as his first calls. So everyone is expecting it. I also think it's interesting. I mean, in a way, you would expect America to be the first call, but just because some of the briefings coming from the Burnham camp about how he's going to focus less on foreign affairs and almost implying that they want to take, that they thought Keir Starmer was too deferential in his relationship with the US, that he still went for America first. But obviously everyone was trying to find out, had the call happened and then what was said. And the first line came from Politico, which was this line saying that he'd invited him to Manchester. So then I started messaging around saying, is this the case? To people on both sides of the pond. And what came back was, yes, but there's a pre-existing invite for the US president to come to Manchester because the G20 is being held in Manchester in 2027. Now, this was a decision I understand was made by Keir Starmer months ago, but no one knew the location was Manchester publicly. They hadn't announced it. It had been kept a secret. So I think in a way it has offered Andy Burnham a way to potentially get Donald Trump to Manchester. So of course, their bromance could be so strong that Donald Trump feels a need to visit Manchester before next year. But I think if there was a place to do it, it is when the G20 comes. Now, Trump doesn't always go. Sometimes he might send, for example, Marco Rubio instead. But that would be the natural route, and one the US side, I understand, are considering to get Trump to the city that he once called a town.
Okay. Look, they also talked, we know, about the situation in the Middle East. You'd think that there might be some White House reservations about Ed Miliband as Foreign Secretary, not just because he loved wind turbines, but also because of his view on foreign affairs. And sooner or later, you'd have thought there is going to be some tension over whether or not Britain backs Donald Trump in whatever he wants to do next in the Middle East. What are we expecting there? How do we think that relationship's going to develop?
Yeah, certainly. I think when we're thinking about, warm words, good beginning, from the number 10 perspective, but exactly that, we know that where the Keir Starmer Donald Trump relationship really soured, and this was, the Donald Trump who would praise how much he liked how much he liked Keir Starmer's wife, and his accent, but where the point where there was signs of tension, but when it really broke, that was on the use of bases when it came to the Iran war, which then when Trump doubled down even further on things like the Chagos Islands, because it all linked back to this. I think Ed Miliband as Foreign Secretary is going to be a controversial choice. I think right now, publicly, I think the US side is deciding to, be a good ally as they see it and try and, welcome Andy Burnham. But certainly in advance, there's a story Stephen Smithford and I did a few weeks ago, which was US officials warning that they were concerned about Ed Miliband becoming Chancellor. Now, I think those same officials had some concerns about Ed Miliband becoming Foreign Secretary. Perhaps Foreign Secretary is less bad for them than Chancellor, but the same concerns remain, which is effectively, I think that Ed Miliband, his energy policy, you might say, well, what does that even have to do with being Foreign Secretary? He's no longer in charge of energy policy. And as Chancellor, that was certainly a US concern. But the US perspective is effectively they link the UK not having a strong enough economy to not being a strong enough ally. They think we need to be a stronger ally, and therefore they link that directly partly to the UK's energy policy and the net zero policy, oil and gas, as we know the Trump is focused on. So that means Ed Miliband is already in their radar. We know he had one meeting with the US ambassador Warren Stevens, and they didn't have a second, as the US ambassador told me at the Times CEO summit earlier this year. And then I think you look at Ed Miliband's disposition, and I think it could be potentially a rocky ride. And one thing I think to look out for is Marco Rubio, who is now going to be Ed Miliband's counterpart. He's just started a campaign against the ICC, the International Criminal Court, talking about, the problem with it, the fact they don't take these rulings seriously, how it's become a show called, all these things. And that started about a week or so ago in full swing. I think Ed Miliband is seen as someone who supports that, as the UK government does, but particularly does. And the fact that in his first list of things that he plans to do, he talks about, protecting international law, at a time when I think if you think back to a Donald Trump interview, maybe last year when he was asked, what controls you international? It's like nothing. You can just start to see a little bit of a collision course early on.
Yeah, I think so. Look, we understand that the Trump administration has just announced 50% tariffs on Canadian goods. I must admit, I'd sort of forgotten about tariffs. Why has this happened? How's it being justified by the White House? What's this all about?
Well, we know that when it comes to the countries that, I suppose not the countries that, or leaders that Trump falls out with, because the list is ever changing. Think about how Maloney has gone from Trump whisperer to what he's fallen out with to a little bit better now. But on the consistent naughty list, Mark Carney and Canada are pretty high up. And for example, you hear about the 51st state on Canada, but it's taken a turn for the worst recently, partly because you had a situation where you've had the wildfires in the US, and Trump has blamed that on Canada, saying, Canada needs to get their house in order because wildfires there are becoming a problem over in the US. This has led to mixed messages from the US side, because you had some, I think you had diplomats for Trump saying, oh, we're not blaming Canada, and then the Trump True Social arrives, and it turns out the US president does. But he signed three proclamations imposing this new 50% tariff that's not scheduled to take effect for another 30 days. And it's ultimately a long-running trade dispute between the two sides. The specific reason is going back to a tariff act of 1930, but it ultimately comes down to the fact that Trump believes America's getting a bad deal and is trying to use force to do that. And I think how Mark Carney responds, which so far is to say, this is preposterous, Canada will hold its own. I think if you do tariffs this drastic, it is uncomfortable for both sides. And of course, the question is, does the consumer end up paying in the end?
What additional products are being taxed, or is it all of them?
So vehicles, alcohol, dairy, there's a mix in terms of the product.
Pretty significant areas, though. absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
exactly. Like this, if this does go through, and again, there's obviously a nickname for Donald Trump, which is Taco, which is Trump always chickens out, and he doesn't like this nickname. But the origins, even though people use it on the Iran war, the origins of this nickname were tariffs, because obviously you go back to Liberation Day, as he called it, and these big announcements, and then the markets didn't take it very well, and eventually there was big efforts behind the scenes to walk back some of these drastic tariffs. So it really became a US China thing by the end of it. So I think there's always a little bit of skepticism, which is by the time we hit 30 days, is he going to really go through with this, or will some compromise be reached? But of course, if he does, and I think, as I say, that's going to be felt by both countries. And I think it's the type of thing where, you do potentially have, American consumers feeling this as well as Canadians.
Sure. Look, finally, Katy, the Vice President JD Vance and his wife have welcomed their fourth baby. They're the first sitting second couple to do this in 150 years. What can you tell us?
Yes, so this is, I suppose, happy news for the vice president and the Trump administration. Donald Trump, as ever, likes to be the person to break news. So while he didn't break the news of the actual birth, he did manage to get the photo up first of the fourth addition to the Vance family. I think it's probably a bit of a reminder of just how young JD Vance is. If you think historically, vice presidents. We obviously have very old presidents at the moment. Trump having recently turned 80, only the second president to do so in office after Joe Biden. And then you have JD Vance at 41, which is a reminder when you think about his future political ambitions that he actually has a lot of time. Most would think, if he didn't get the nomination for 2028, he had perhaps missed his shot. And, in terms of political cycles, you never quite know when all the factors are going to come. Maybe that's the case. But, his career by political standards is really in its youth. I mean, he was only a senator for about a year before he was picked P. And I suppose the other thing going around is because he had this fourth child, now they're a bigger family. There's been some stories about how he's stressing out the Secret Service by, using a helicopter to take one of his sons to golf courses, and, implying that he's being a bit of a headache. But I think it also speaks to the Secret Service are not used to having a family with very young children trying to lead a semi-normal life while also being vice president. And to that, there's also talk that they may be getting a house in Middleburg, which is this quite fancy town in Virginia, near to Washington, D.C.,
Sure.
Which I once went to and thought was very, I was really venturing out of D.C. and a woman told me in a pub, "Welcome to the most English town in America."
Okay. Oh, I'll have to visit and see. Katy Balls, thank you very much indeed. Katy is Washington editor at The Times and The Sunday Times. Always good to speak to Katy. And of course, you can hear Katy every week on The Times podcast, The State of It USA.